I heard once, escaping from a phone's cracked screen, the weary voice of the internet. Help, child, I am like a wind, hurled by vengeful Aeolus at the Sind. Could be such a sweet adornment.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Solacene, the podcast where we imagine the ideal future that is beautiful, sustainable, and tactile. This week, we are imagining the Solacene search engine. So what would the best search engine ever look like?
Ooh.
And then we're also going to talk about trolls, not the movies, but the scum of the earth.
Okay.
Who troll the internet.
Yeah.
And finally, we're going to talk about how culture seems to turn over quite quickly these days, and if that's just a figment of our imagination or if that's actually something that's happening, and perhaps how we can slow things down, even if just for ourselves.
But first of all, let me talk about the poem that I just introduced the episode with. It had kind of a threefold inspiration. The first of which, I've always liked that like comic gag where someone shouts into a vase or a jar and then opens it later and the cry comes out, because I always used to think as a child that was real. And it doesn't seem that implausible, you know what I mean? Like, I know it's not real, but when you think about the cans with the strings and you can like make little telephones like that, like, it's not that crazy. So that's the first thing. And I was like, if you broke a screen, it's like you just hear a sound of the internet. And the second is a game that we used to play where it was like, make a sound that demonstrates how you feel inside. That sounds like something you'd say to like a 4-year-old, but I guess that's just the way we talk to each other. Do you remember what mine usually was?
It was always something very like neutral.
Yeah.
Which is usually how you feel. You're a very stoic person.
True. And I was like, it would be funny if you could kind of personify the internet like this and have it make a sound. And the third is the fact that I do actually have a really, really cracked smartphone. And I've always, or since that happened, that fateful day, we won't talk about that because Alicia is to blame for the listeners who want to know. Since that happened, I've always been like, oh, it's kind of, sounds bad, but it's kind of embarrassing to an extent because it's not like a tiny crack. I'm that guy who it's like, it's in smithereens and sometimes I just get tiny pieces of glass in me fingies. But then I was thinking like, maybe it adds some kind of character depth to me. You know, it's like Solacene, we're kind of somewhat anti-smartphone, or at least anti like the overuse of it. So it's kind of on brand.
Do you have a search engine on your phone?
No.
No, I didn't think you did. Aaron is probably one of the few people in the world that chose to delete his Safari off his iPhone, which is fine. And I think it makes you, if you want to look something up, you have to be intentional about it to go to a desktop or a laptop and do so. It's quite funny. You know that like the Apple, the apps that come with the phone, I don't think you can delete them. So you have to go into screen time and just like deactivate them. So it's technically still on the phone. It's just a flip of the switch away. But I see.
Yeah.
Cool. So my Solacene search engine, I'll start with the aesthetics.
Sure.
I pictured it as being like the Google Doodle, which changes. So I think the search engine will change a bit. It doesn't need to be super crazy, but some days maybe it will be a bit over-designed. Some days it'll be a bit more minimal, just for a little bit of art when you do choose to use the engine. Because right now it's been pretty much the same since the internet started. Like, it's just a white page with text, which is fine. And I mean, like, you don't want people to be like super attracted and stuck on those screens, but I don't think having it look nice would do that. Like, I switched to using Opera like 5 years ago or something, and you can really customize how it looks, and I just find it's like a slightly more pleasant experience if the background of my search is a different color or just a nice picture. Like, it just makes you feel a bit calmer. That was my first point. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a key point. Are you talking about customizing, or are you talking about akin to the Google Doodles, it being a kind of mandated thing that the platform itself designs?
I pictured it being, like, mandated.
Yeah, I like that.
I like how on Windows computers, the background changes different images from, like, all over the world, just like the home screen kind of changes automatically. So it's something like that, just for, and then it might be a conversation starter. It might just be a nice picture.
Speaking aesthetically also, actually I did have an idea for the aesthetics of the background, but or the visuals rather, but it's a bit Mine's a whole concept.
Okay.
So I had a name for mine. Did you have a name for yours?
I didn't.
Mine is Ribbit.
Okay.
Or I guess ours is Ribbit, because this is the solar scene thing we're designing together. So obviously it calls to mind what?
Frog.
Frog, nature, outdoors. Frogs, they actually can't be indoors.
Mm.
Well, I don't know if that's the case, but I've never seen one indoors. Let me put it like that. Well, I have in zoos, but not really in a house or something. So the cursor is green.
Mm.
And the other key thing about Ribbit, the name, is I don't really like how Google it has become part of the lexicon. People say that so often. It's like, I'll Google it, because it's such a lazy thing. So this kind of, it tries to deter people from saying that all the time, because no one's going to say ribbit it. You know what I mean?
But they would say I'd ribbit.
But that's not that's not accurate. I mean, they might kind of bastardize it like that, but that's not. No, I'm not having that.
Fine.
So anyway, it's to try and stop that from creeping in.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually thought maybe next week we could talk about these subtle or sometimes not so subtle ways that internet language has become has leaked into wider usage.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Like, we're going to talk about trolling later, and I think that's something that's kind of happened a little bit there as well. So anyway, for Ribbit, I was thinking, I had a few points. Some of them are a bit radical, and I didn't really think it through all the way. But regarding the homepage, I was thinking if it had a real, or the background, or, you know, the visuals, if it had a real kind of like place feeling to it. Mm-hmm. And my inspiration was like Miiverse on the Wii U, the much maligned Wii U. But I really thought it had a cool kind of homey UI. So it's like you went on it and it's like, this is neat. And along the lines of maybe even blurring the lines of it being social networky, you could see popular searches in your geographic area. Mm-hmm. Or friends or other people. Obviously, if they make it available. Like sometimes you don't want people to see like, oh, how to dissolve a body or something like that.
But maybe that would hold people accountable to not Google.
Well, that went through my head, but the thing is, I often Google things because I like to write.
Yeah.
So I often, like, let's say you're writing a thriller and you actually are Googling how to dissolve a body because you need to know.
True,
so sometimes you Google, you look things up, you research things for
what are these weird bumps on my toes?
Exactly.
You don't, I guess you'd prefer to keep that a little more private. Okay, my number one thing that I thought of was no ads, which is kind of, I mean, I say that every single week, but once again, I say it, no ads, mainly in this context, because lately when you Google something, the first 5 to 10 results say ad.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't actually know what one thing is the best. For example, I'm working on this project and we use Asana for team management. So I type in Asana and then the first 5 results are alternatives to Asana that people are like marketing as alternatives to that. Anyway, no ads in the Solacene. It'll just be what you're looking for. If it's trying to say one specific website, it would be that. And maybe there would just be one result. Like if I typed in Asana, there'd be one search result and it would be the website.
That's not a bad idea. You could maybe that not be the only option, but maybe you can customize it so it's like you can choose how many things appear. Because I don't think there's a way to change it so it isn't just 3 million other, search results. Regarding the order of things and how they appear, I was thinking this might be a neat place for an AI or for some kind of smart system. Mm-hmm. So obviously we want a search engine to be quite objective, let's say politically or whatever. You don't want it to be skewed in that regard, but it could be skewed towards more thoughtful things or more Solacene things, more ribbity things, more beautiful, sustainable, tactile things. So for instance, it could prioritize articles with depth, articles that, let's say, were written by humans.
Yeah. Something
like that, because I'm guessing in the future a lot of the internet, not in the Solacene, but there will be, or if there isn't already, quite a proliferation of machine-generated, quote-unquote, content. Mm-hmm. So it's like, we could kind of try and filter that out through some kind of algorithm.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. My next point was exactly that, or not exactly that, but more filter options right now. There's kind of the tabs, shopping, images, news.
Yeah.
But you could even set that before you search. So perhaps you're looking for news or a blog or what have it. And then you could also even break it down further. So maybe you're looking for shopping options, but you want it to be within a certain radius. Or you only want to see 5 options, and if it's not there, it's not there. Kind of these more self-imposed limits and just allowing it to be as specific as possible.
Right.
I also had, right now you can basically type in like, how cook to me meat, and it would just give you like exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah.
But I think in the Solacene, there won't be spell check kind of thing. Something a bit more, if you want to look something up, you have to type in exactly what you want, like a well-phrased question.
Yeah. That's a good point. Actually quite pertinent to this podcast as well, because we often struggle with actually phrasing questions.
Yeah.
So like for this week, we just went trolls ? So it's like maybe actually requiring people to type like they were speaking might be, because you would never say that to people.
No. Trolls? You're like, what do you think of trolls? Or
if you go up to someone who's like a good barbecue, it's like, how cook pork shoulder roast or something.
Yeah. Like, I think you have to phrase the questions as a human. And if you want it to be more specific, you could either have these filter options, or like I know with Google and search engines, you can put things in quotes or minus things. Yeah. I've been doing a bit of that for one of my jobs, and it's like trying to find search results. I actually came to the end of Google for the first time on like a search. It was very rewarding.
I do that all the time. If you search for very, very specific things.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it made me think perhaps we could do a bit more of this.
Also, people listening who maybe are quite savvy with browsers might be like, oh, you can do all these things on Google if you just, it's not really intuitive. I think even like the quotation marks on Google, it's not that intuitive because only a few people know it, let alone all the like and symbols, and like if you put the minus or if you do an underscore here or a colon there, it's like, so although I do think there are quite a few elements of existing search engines that I think are kind of cool in Solacene that I wanted to shout out. So for instance, I really think it's neat that you can highlight a word and find the definition.
Yeah, that is cool.
It's really cool that you can highlight a word and find the translation should you wish. And I know there's some browsers where you can draw on them and like mark them up. And I think that's neat as well, making it a bit more of a book or something.
I always wish that was a thing. Like I know some browsers have it, but the ones I use don't.
Yeah.
And I just wish, because when you're reading an article, usually I'll read through it and then get out my notebook and go through again and like write the notes. But it would be nice if you could kind of highlight as you go. My final thing with the Solacene browser is that it would be solar powered. Therefore, perhaps dependent on weather and also time of day. Like maybe the browser's only open from like 9 to 5 or something.
Oh, limit like that.
I mean, it's a little bit hard to implement, but just as an idea, as a kind of hypothetical idea, some kind of limit. It could be associated with the solar power, but it could also be associated with just, this is when it's open. If you need to get a recipe, get it during these hours.
Yeah, I had an idea for that, actually inspired by everyone's favorite new social media, Be Real, that only lets you post one Be Real a day. If you were permitted like a finite number of searches. Yeah. And I know this sounds like maybe it often does on Solacene, like we're advocating for some really like totalitarian or dystopian policies where people are only on some kind of like search stamps where you have to line up to get your three searches a day. But the key point, I think, in the Solacene is that people will do these things themselves. But for instance, in the software, if it was like a set number a day or a week, probably a week, I think that would be okay. It would encourage people to actually pay more attention to what they learn or what they read on there. And also it would discourage frivolous searches, because I think that's something that's really awful about the internet or the search engines of today, is that you're kind of inclined to look things up that you either already know or that you could already figure out on your own, but you're too lazy to do it. So this would discourage that type of thing. Like for instance, if let's say you didn't have a weather app and you typed in like weather this morning, blah, 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 it's like you could kind of just gauge that. Yeah. For the most part. Or I don't know, a math thing or a conversion of an oven temperature. There's a lot of, all the reasons people use the internet for small things like that. And also along those lines of like math and temperature, this is a bit of a personal nitpick of mine, but I don't like how Google has a built-in calculator or like certain responses. So like if you type in Tom Hanks' age,
it just comes up.
Like Tom Hanks 68. It's like, let me find it myself. Yeah. Stop spoon feeding me this thing. Or Wikipedia, it has kind of a link with Wikipedia where it's like that's specially on the right side of the page and it'll provide stuff. It's like, stay in your lane. That's what I think Ribbit will do. Stay in its lane.
There's certain countries that are regulating that now because Google doesn't pay the news outlets for that information. So it's like putting in this rule that if Google wants to use these kind of automated responses, population of Canada or whatever, they have to like pay the websites that they're getting the information from, because right now they don't. Also, 2 more things. One, like the internet kind of has that built in with the limited number of articles you can read on certain news outlets without paying.
True, yeah.
So that's kind of one thing that I catch myself being mindful of. Like I'll click on a Guardian article. It's like, okay, you have 4 more free articles this month. And so it makes me actually read it instead of just clicking back out.
You could just subscribe.
I know, but at the moment.
You're a New Yorker girl anyway. So.
I'm not a New Yorker girl.
Very loyal about your newspaper.
But there's that. And then also, I think when GEP, is that the letters?
No, but I'll let it stand at that. I know the answer, but I think it's just a funny Solacene thing that you...
Don't know.
Chat GDP, is it?
Well, Chat GDP per capita is... When they first came out, I remember they had a limit of like 5 searches a day because it was so overrun and the server wasn't like...
I don't know.
It wasn't robust enough for all the people that all of a sudden were like giving it demands, and you had to pay for a... Anyway, like it also had that. No one was like upset. It was just like, yeah, that makes sense. Like there's only a certain number of servers. If we're all trying to look things up on it at once, then it's going to crash. So.
You ran into that problem, did you?
I still have never used it, and
neither have I.
Never will.
My final point on Ribbit is if it had some way of visualizing, maybe through like a timeline that pops up every few minutes, or that you can toggle on and off or something, how deep you are into a browsing session. Because, for instance, I find myself often, let's say I'm reading about a poem, and I'll go to the Wikipedia page or another page for that, and there's so many hyperlinks on the Wikipedia page that interest me.
Yeah.
I'll click one of those, read more, click one of those, read more. And so you kind of can lose yourself and are just falling down a rabbit hole rather than really reading to remember. You're just kind of reading to discover, which is, it's okay. But I think if we had that reminder of, even if it just said, you've been on here for 16 minutes.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be something. I'm taking a bit of guidance from like Nintendo games where they used to pop up like that on the Wii.
Yeah.
Whereas like, you've been here for a while.
Yeah.
Take a break. I think that's
Go outside. One thing, just a little tip before we move on, that I do kind of along those lines is when I'm preparing for these episodes, which is when I spend the most time on the internet, I go through, I write, like we have all 2 or 3 questions, and I open up every article that I want to read in tabs at the top of my browser. So then I see, okay, there's 10 tabs open. Then as I close them, it's like the progress. But so it's kind of like I can set that for my week.
Yeah.
That those are all the things I need to read. And then once I'm done, I'm done. And like, I also don't let myself open new tabs as I find them, because I'm like, okay, I give like kind of a skim to each of them before deeply reading them. Just some kind of system like that is kind of useful for limiting your rabbit holes.
Interesting. Or your ribbit holes, rather.
Yeah.
Ribbit holes. That could be the name of the feature. It writes itself, this stuff.
It really does.
Meme of the week is the My FBI Agent meme.
Oh, okay.
You know this one?
Yeah, I do.
So it originated in 2018 on Twitter. For those who don't know or are new to Solacene, every week this semester, because we're talking about the internet, we feature a meme of the week, which we try and extract some kind of deeper meaning from. And this one, there'll be text and image, and it will say, my FBI agent when something funny. So like, my FBI agent watching me take 100 selfies only to post none of them.
Yeah.
And it's poking fun of the idea of digital or government surveillance and the idea that we might have something like a guardian angel watching us always through our screens, an FBI agent we've each been assigned, who is kind of becoming bored or like laughing at the silly things that we do on our devices.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of the obvious insight here, which is that, people are making light of this dystopian surveillance when really we shouldn't have to tape up our webcams or like think that our phones are listening to us or whatever. But I think on this podcast, we just kind of take it for granted that that's awful and that shouldn't happen, and that it does happen.
Yeah.
It's like when people say really kind of enthusiastically like, oh, the phones listen to us, I just kind of shrug. Because
Like, yeah, they do. Because
probably.
it just proves it like 10 times a day.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, whatever. It's like, don't talk to your phone. Turn your phone off. How about that? Or like, get rid of your phone. There's just, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a trite observation. But maybe a deeper thing with this meme, it kind of reflects how much people perceive, or it's just the case that our digital life is more prominent or more real than our actual life. Because I think if you had this kind of thing going on in the 90s, people were joking about each of us having a personalized government agent watching us. The picture would be of someone stalking you on the street.
Yeah.
Right, but now it's just someone sitting on the other side of the country or the continent watching you through a screen. Because apparently they can take a full enough snapshot of your life just through the way you interact with the internet or your devices.
Yeah.
So that's something.
Yeah. If it was in the 90s, you'd be like my FBI agent when I get my third slushie of the day or whatever. It would be like something you actually did, not just when I closed my 5th shopping cart of the day or something like that.
Yeah. And the other thing that it's really quite obvious in this meme is that it points out how frivolous most of our digital activities really are, because almost all the memes will be poking fun in kind of a self-deprecating way about how we essentially waste time online. You know, it's about taking selfies, or mine would be like my FBI agent watching me play the 10th Blitz chess game online in a row or something like that. And it's always, because it's never something like that you'd be proud of, because there actually isn't that much that most people do online that they are proud of. That's what I'm talking about. Do you have anything like what would yours be? I mean,
I'm trying to think of what I do on the internet. I look up a lot of recipes.
Yeah, that's what it would be.
So it'd be something
it would be like
that,
my FBI agent rolling his eyes when I search up gluten-free cookie recipes at 1 a.m.
Yeah, that would be it. Yeah, that would definitely be mine. When I look up the same recipe for like the 10th time because I still can't remember it or whatever.
Trolls. Great film.
Justin Timberlake.
Yeah.
Shout out to him.
Come on the show. JT.
Okay, Trolls. I learned that trolls, obviously there's the connotation of the gremlin creature that lives in a cave.
Or under a bridge.
Yeah, or under a bridge. That's where they live. But it originated from trolling, as in like trolling the bottom of the sea.
Isn't that trolling?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it like originated from that.
So it got
trolling, and then it quickly changed into trolls. So I was like, that's kind of interesting, because that kind of is what they do. They just like skim the bottom of the sea, trying to either attract people into their traps or just dwelling on the bottom.
Right. Bottom feeders. We're talking about this because during the week I had an idea that we could do an episode about like rules for the internet, rules for how you can conduct yourself on the Solacene internet. And it reminded me that the first and real only rule of the internet that I know of is don't feed the trolls.
Yeah.
Because that's something that I feel like if we were to do a Solacene primer for young children before they're allowed on the internet, akin to like a driver's ed before getting a driver's license, that would be something that you do like a module on.
Yeah.
It's about like identifying trolls and engaging with them, or not engaging with them rather.
Yeah.
In an emotionally mature way. So this is going to be quite a small segment, I think, because the answer for the Solacene is obvious. Like, there's no trolls in the Utopia. So just some background. I had the definition of trolls, not the mythological one. It is a person who makes a deliberately offensive or provocative online post. Or obviously you can use it kind of to refer to that post. That's a troll post.
Yeah. I didn't really know much about trolls because I avoid them at all costs, or any parts of the internet that may have them. But I did a little bit of psychological research into like the psychology of these people.
Yeah.
And the most spookish part is that a lot of trolls, based on like analysis of the behavior of people online, are just normal people. Like, they don't actually score really high on the dark tetrad, which I didn't know which that was. Do you know what the dark tetrad of personality traits is?
Machiavellian something.
Yeah, it's Machiavellian, sadistic, narcissistic, and psychopathy. So like people who, it was like only 4% of trolls actually score high on these things, which means they're just like villains.
Well, this actually might be kind of pertinent to the etymological shift that I was talking about earlier, when I don't like how troll has become a bit more of a common parlance thing. Like, if someone is just joking around now, they say, oh, some people might say in real life, like, it sounds a bit of a stretch, but young people say like, oh, he's just trolling.
Yeah,
like,
people definitely
like
say
me,
that.
I'm always just kind of like joking around and pulling tiny pranks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, I don't know, like if you replace the salt with sugar
Yeah.
on the kitchen table, it's like, oh, he's just trolling around.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't like that. And also, so the reason I say it might reflect that is because I think it's a bit more of a verb now than it is a noun. You know, there aren't just that 4% of trolls. Everybody kind of trolls sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody trolls.
Everybody trolled. Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
But
But we don't want them to.
No. That was the spookiest thing, was that it's like most people who do the trolling, which is often quite aggressive and just like making people upset on purpose.
Yeah.
They're just normal people who want to feel something.
Well, I was just thinking about how much of a pathetic waste of time it is.
Yeah.
And I was kind of trying to relate back to my own experience. And I talked a few weeks ago about my embarrassing feud I got into on Reddit about something Solacene related or like screen related. I don't remember exactly. And I was like, well, that person could have just been trolling, right? Like they could just be saying deliberately instigating things. It could be as mild as you go onto the Dallas Cowboys Facebook page and be like, oh, this quarterback kind of sucks, huh? Because you know that people, it's like, one, that's very pathetic, but two, is it much less pathetic to kind of be baited and get genuinely frustrated or even irate about what some anonymous stranger is saying on the internet? Like that's...
Yeah, it's equally unfortunate that it happens, but it's kind of human nature. Like if someone is trying to make you upset, like it takes a lot of self-control and like willpower to not be upset by it.
Do you think?
I think so.
I think we're a little bit too thin-skinned. And also we don't often act, not you and I, but like generally speaking, we treat the internet a little bit too seriously.
Yeah.
Whereas it should be like, it doesn't, that person's probably not real. Like my default now is like, it's probably a kid.
Yeah, or they're not real, or
if someone in real life came up to you and was like, oh, doesn't this kind of suck? Then you could have an actual conversation, and you could also read their body language and their age to determine whether they are earnest or not. Another thing is that this kind of raises questions, I think, about internet civility and moderation and censorship. Like having actual moderators is what I'm talking about. So maybe we could talk about that a bit next week.
Yeah, I think so. There's an effect called the online disinhibition effect, which just means, everybody, even if they're not kids, is just much more likely to have no inhibitions when they're posting online.
Yeah.
Like...
because it's not real.
Yeah, because it's not real. But it does, because we're on it so much, feel so deeply real. Trolls are often overtly political as well. They're not always, but it's a very common tactic used mainly on the alt-right, but there's also people on the left who do it. A famous example used in a few articles and books that I saw about trolls was this person who he was in his mid-40s. He had just been through a divorce, just been diagnosed with like a really severe disease, and was just going through it like life was just throwing punches kind of thing. And he made a fake Twitter account as a fake senator. I think he was pretending to be a right-wing senator in the United States.
Okay.
And he was trying to get back at people on the left. So he was like sparking debate with like Hillary Clinton and like these pretty prominent left-wing figures. And they were like getting into full-on arguments with him on Twitter. And it's like, but it was fake. Like he said that he was like the senator of a certain district that just like doesn't even exist. So it's like it doesn't even take that much time to...
One of the other reasons why the internet is a poor place for political discourse, we could talk about that in a future episode as well. On the example of like a more collective, famous incident of trolling, I suppose, or at least something adjacent, I've always been thinking about in 2016, the UK did some kind of like public internet poll to name their new cutting edge science boat that would be like collecting data. And the answer that won, the new name for it that won by a massive distance was Boaty McBoatface.
Yeah.
And now there's kind of, I looked it up, it's kind of being coined as an effect. It's like the McBoatface effect or McBoatfacing. It can loosely be defined, I saw on the internet, as the critical mistake of letting the internet decide things. So this is obviously that anonymity and trolling that we already identified, combined with the collective like desire to kind of just not watch the world burn, but like make fun of things entirely.
Yeah, the internet just feels like any initiative ever enacted in a high school when it's like, we're going to get everyone to like draw a picture and we'll make a mural, and they're just all pictures of like explicit images or whatever. And it's like, well, that was a great idea.
So I think in the solo scene, obviously people will be a bit more emotionally mature. They'll be happier. They'll believe in things more. Like, you would genuinely be excited, like, oh, that's a really cool new boat.
Yeah.
Like, there would actually be that.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be like, new boat. Let's call it something ridiculous. It's like, take it seriously.
Yeah.
More emotionally mature. One, not to do the trolling. Two, not to get baited by the trolls. And also, they just value their time more. I think that's the main thing. It's like, what are you doing on Twitter?
Yeah, like, it's not going to bring you any joy. Like, it'll bring you very, very quick dopamine release or whatever. I also learned one more thing about trolls when I was doing my research, which I found interesting. I don't know if it's fully true, but it was a theory that trolls are kind of an attempt to keep the internet, in air quotes, for the boys kind of thing. In 2011, there was something called Gamergate, which I didn't know about, but it was kind of people getting upset about girls becoming gamers. And I feel like trolls kind of, to an extent, have that of trying to gatekeep the internet as a place for these kind of hardcore techie people. And I mean, that's kind of a far-fetched theory, but it does slightly feel like if anyone posts something naive or something earnest online, it immediately gets trolled.
Yeah.
And I feel like it might be even subconsciously a way to get to kind of keep those people away because they don't like their influence.
Yeah. Oh, there probably is a gendered element to it also, but I just think on a broader sense, it is people think it's the purest manifesting of populism, of the, not just for the boys, but for the common folk, for the average folk. I think that's how people, certainly politically, if you look at like where memes are often directed and where they come from, it's an us against the elite type dynamic, whether the elite be whoever built that British boats, or whether it be Fox News, or whether it be CNN. It's us against the establishment, and people don't like the internet maybe becoming establishment or something. Net neutrality, that's another thing that's in here somewhere. We could talk about that next week maybe.
Okay.
As well.
Yeah.
On to the third and final question of today, which is about forgotbusters. So you introduced the term last week, and just generally the idea of the internet's quick cultural change and what that means for the zeitgeist, if such a word is even relevant today. But I had a quote which I thought was just quite funny because it came out and did the rounds just in the last week from Tarantino about Netflix original streaming films. Specifically, he called out the Ryan Reynolds things. Let's just call them like Red Notice, I think is the name of one of them. Or there's another one, The Adam Project. Was that one?
I don't know.
Yeah,
you could put any combo of words, like the Silver Bullet.
It's true. The werewolf film. And he just said, those movies don't exist in zeitgeist. It's almost like they don't even exist. There was a fuller quote, but I thought that was the most concise way of quoting him for the episode. And that had a neat kind of ring to it, wherein him obviously talking as a director who's made movies that people really, really talk about every time a new one comes out. This idea that maybe culturally, and that's speaking of films more as like cultural aspects and artistic ones, popular film that is, it's kind of like if the tree falls in the forest, no one's to hear it, you know what I mean? Except it's maybe more about remembering.
Yeah. I think what he's getting at to an extent, especially with the Netflix example, is that in the 80s, there used to be a lot of blockbusters.
Yeah.
And this is where the term forgotbuster kind of originated, was in the 70s, 80s, because there'd be these things and everybody would go see them, but then we'd kind of forget about them in 2 or 3 years. But even then, like, we still could list them. Like, I think for the most part, you could list probably a lot of things that like were blockbusters, but we don't really talk about too much anymore.
Yeah.
But then with Netflix, there's so much to focus on, but we have the same amount of time to split our focus. So it's like, yeah, you can be just genuinely excited about something, but then because an even better movie comes out or one of equal excitement comes out within the week, you have to move on. And an assessment of trends says that, like, yeah, there's the same amount of trends, if not more, but we adopt them quicker and drop them quicker, so they don't actually have the staying power. Whereas it's like trends used to be like, yeah, we'd adopt them, we'd keep them for some time, and then drop them.
Let's say, with fashions, like
exactly.
A year. That's so last summer, whatever. Yeah, I think there's something to that. It's almost like as soon as something becomes recognized, it's passé. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do think there's an extent to which people, maybe even us on this podcast, exaggerate a little bit how new this phenomena is and the fragmentation of the zeitgeist, let's say. I mean, things have obviously accelerated and are still accelerating. But when you look at all the, like, let's say, not the most acclaimed, but the best-selling books from 1900 to 1990 each year, or even the best highest-grossing film, they are often kind of consigned to forgot-busters, I guess. Like, they don't last very long. They don't stick around very long.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's an element of that. And I also think when people compare, let's say, post-internet, today's culture to when things were a bit more zeitgeisty and we would all move on to something together and we'd all watch this together and then talk about this together at the water cooler or through the radio or through the newspapers. That's definitely true that things are more fragmented today and we can kind of choose our own culture and it isn't very geographic based. And, we talked about this a lot on the semester, but it's not that new a thing, because I think obviously if we compare it to, say, the 1980s, this is quite different and a lot less communal and a lot less probably healthy. But if you compare it to like the 1880s or something, they weren't all, like, everyone in the country wasn't talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Or for most of human history, that is.
So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
It was just kind of something that happened for like 50 to 100 years.
Yeah. Obviously, there's a big difference between that being a local culture like it was in the 1800s to being a culture entirely divorced of place like it is today. But
yeah, I think that's kind of, it's come full circle in that in the 1800s, we were still seeking out like cultural experiences to share. But now we don't really seek them out because there's this fear that they're going to be dropped before we can even adopt them. But I feel like in the 1800s, there was no fear. Like if there was a trend kind of going around town of what kind of hat to wear, you could, for the most part, buy it and like be good for a few years. And I mean, that's still, even in the 1800s, 1700s, wasn't fully true because the elite did intentionally turn over trends really quickly so that it couldn't be disseminated. But I mean, just within like common people, it was a bit more acceptable to like be late to a trend kind of and just like accept it. But now there's a fear to even, I feel like we're all hipsters in that sense of like being afraid to adopt any trend because it's going to be dropped.
It's a lot worse than standing out also. But I also think central to this is just the increased self-awareness that the internet has given us, and maybe even vanity. So like if we're talking about clothes, obviously we'll do kind of a whole semester about fashion at some point in the future, but I feel like when it comes to the cyclical nature of nostalgia and fashion trends, people have become so kind of self-aware about that everyone could tell you like, oh, it's usually on a 20 to 30 year cycle. Like young people are talking about this kind of thing. And so for instance, when we see an attempt at something like an early 2000s revival or like making that into a trend, and I use that word attempt like deliberately, it feels very self-conscious a choice, as in like, well, now it's time to do this. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel as organic as, let's say, previous nostalgia or, the cyclical nature of trends has done. And also on that note, I think it's really interesting that we seem to be clinging on so much, not just in clothes, but just in the general zeitgeist, to the 70s, 80s, and 90s to a lesser extent. And it's maybe staying on a bit longer than things like that usually do.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of this is it's just a general romance for pre-internet times.
Yeah,
like
I think so.
I think the only outlier to the whole like forgot-busters concept and that of the internet consigning more of these things to irrelevancy and not making an imprint on the zeitgeist are the Marvel movies, right? And something really interesting about those is that they don't really have much that sets them in today's day. Like you don't really see many of the characters on their smartphones or things like this.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're just kind of like neutral.
Yeah, I'm sure they will be dateable, but I think there's a lot less of an instinct or a desire to, let's say, capture what's happening today on film. I don't know.
No, I think that's super true because people who made movies kind of in the earlier days of film were kind of like proud of what was going on. It's like, we're going to talk about our triumph in the war. We're going to talk about this really cool new technology or our vision for the future.
Yeah.
But now it's kind of like, we're going to talk about all those old things that we used to do, but not really about what people are doing. And when films are made that are really authentic, set in today's time, perhaps about like family issues or about climate change, they're not widely enjoyed.
There's always been kind of the highbrow, more niche stuff that kind of escapes us. But I think blockbusters, that's why that's such a key conversation. And also talking about them, I've been thinking recently a bit about what I'll just loosely call the Deadpool effect. I don't know if that's actually a term, but wherein the media, let's call it that, doesn't really want you to take it seriously and therefore doesn't really want you to remember it. It kind of always comes with a wink like, well, this doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And I think I say that because in Deadpool, that's, I think, the best example of it. But also it leaked into a lot of the other Marvel movies or just a lot of the other blockbusters that happen today. And so it's not so much that I think quality has decreased in big blockbusters in, let's say, like from 2 decades ago to now. Although I think it has, but I don't think that's the main thing. I think it's that they don't often present themselves fully seriously. So for instance, you'll have like many attempts at a heartfelt moment or like a reconciliation or even a dramatic moment, and so often a character just comes in and says, well, that was awkward or something, and it's like, just tell the story. And so I think that's quite relevant. Like, I just finished watching a movie called Stargate from the 90s, which wasn't a great movie, but it was a blockbuster, and I was just struck by the fact that it presented itself utterly self-seriously. There was really one gag, which was that the main character sneezed at sometimes inopportune times. Yeah. But that kind of stood out as quite a modern thing. But for the most part, it was like, there's melodrama, the characters act kind of emotionally like they're all there. I mean, present in the time. And so maybe we could actually talk about this, I know this is a bit all over the place, but maybe next week we could also talk about how the internet and that, I'd say, Deadpool effect has changed our own emotions or the way that we react to things in real life.
That's a good point. I think another thing that's common in movies is when somebody dies, because of, like, for example, the James Bond or those types of movies, it's like, he's dead, but is he? And it's like, he's never actually dead. Like, when characters die or when something, like, really serious happens, like, maybe they're converted to a bad guy or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
There's just, like, no stakes. And, like, they don't even want you to think there's stakes. It's just kind of like, it'll be back.
We have a bit more of that media literacy now, where we don't really take things at face value, which is probably to our detriment as viewers.
Yeah.
And also, there's obviously been the comic book effect, where it's like, no one ever stays dead in comic books.
Yeah.
So.
I have a quote to close us out. Trends can only reach critical mass if the masses are not too critical. Thanks for listening.
Bye.